The autumn rain fell steadily on Greenwood Cemetery, each droplet seeming to echo the hollow ache in Margaret Wells's chest as she stood alone beside her husband's freshly covered grave. The gray headstone bore James's name in elegant script, but the words blurred through her tears as she clutched a single white rose, the thorns pressing into her palm through her thin black gloves. 20 feet away, the rest of the Wells family huddled together under expensive black umbrellas, their designer funeral attire a stark contrast to Margaret's simple dress from the thrift store on Maple Street. She could hear their whispered conversations carried on the wind, words that cut deeper than any blade. Maybe you're watching this from a place where family dynamics feel familiar, where you've seen how quickly people can turn cold when money and status are involved. If so, you understand the isolation Margaret felt in that moment. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from, because this story of family betrayal and hidden truths might hit closer to home than you expect. Victoria Wells Hampton, James's sister, adjusted her black Chanel coat and leaned closer to their cousin Patricia. "The woman obviously thinks she belongs here," Victoria whispered, her voice dripping with disdain. 5 years of marriage to poor James, and she still looks like she crawled out of that greasy diner where he found her. Patricia nodded knowingly, her diamond earrings catching what little light filtered through the storm clouds. "At least it's finally over," she murmured back. "James can rest in peace without having to pretend that gold-digging waitress actually loved him." Margaret felt their stares like physical weight pressing down on her shoulders. She had known this day would come, had prepared herself for their cruelty, but standing here in the place where she and James had promised to be buried side by side, their hatred felt more vicious than ever. She remembered the first time James brought her to meet his family, how Victoria had looked her up and down like she was examining a questionable piece of merchandise. The interrogation had been swift and merciless. "What do your parents do, dear?" Victoria had asked with a smile that never reached her eyes. Margaret had quietly explained that her parents had died when she was young, that she had worked her way through community college while waiting tables. The family had exchanged those looks, the ones that said everything they needed to know about the inappropriate girl their precious James had chosen. Richard Wells, James's younger brother, checked his platinum Rolex with obvious impatience. His wife, Sarah, stood beside him, occasionally glancing at Margaret with poorly concealed contempt. "We should wrap this up," Richard announced loud enough for Margaret to hear. "Some of us have real obligations to attend to. The estate reading is tomorrow at 2 o'clock sharp." He paused deliberately, turning his cold blue eyes toward Margaret. "I trust everyone who actually belongs there will be in attendance." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow, but she kept her composure, her years of dealing with difficult customers at the diner having taught her to swallow pain and maintain dignity. She knelt slowly beside James's grave, placing the white rose against the headstone. "I love you," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the rain. "I promise I'll make you proud, no matter what they try to do." The family's limousines were already pulling away when Margaret finally stood, her knees soaked from the muddy ground. She watched the sleek black cars disappear into the gray afternoon, carrying away people who had never given her a chance, who had spent 5 years waiting for this moment when they could finally exclude her completely. The irony wasn't lost on her that they were rushing off to their luxury homes in Beacon Hill while she would return to her modest apartment in the working-class neighborhood of Southie, the same area where she had grown up in foster care after her parents' deaths. Victoria's prediction about the estate reading echoed in Margaret's mind as she made her way to the bus stop. She knew James had loved her, had seen it in his eyes every morning when he woke up beside her, had felt it in the way he held her hand when the family made their cutting remarks at holiday dinners. But love didn't always translate into legal documents, especially when expensive attorneys and entitled relatives were involved. The Wells family had made it clear from day one that Margaret was temporary, a phase James would eventually outgrow when he came to his senses and married someone from their social circle. Standing under the bus shelter, Margaret pulled out her phone and scrolled through the photos from happier times. James proposing on the beach in Provincetown, their small wedding ceremony that his family had boycotted, quiet Sunday mornings reading the newspaper together while she made his favorite blueberry pancakes. He had always promised he would take care of her, that she would never have to worry about money or security again. But James had been an optimist, always believing the best in people, including his own family. He had never seen the full extent of their cruelty because they were careful to save their worst behavior for when he wasn't around. The bus arrived 40 minutes late, its doors opening with a mechanical wheeze that seemed to match Margaret's exhaustion. As she settled into a torn vinyl seat, she thought about the lawyer's office where tomorrow's reading would take place, the intimidating building on State Street where she had only been once before, shortly after the wedding. The marble floors and mahogany paneling had made her feel small and out of place, just as James's family intended. Harrison Blackwood, the family attorney, had been polite but distant, treating her with the kind of professional courtesy reserved for people who weren't expected to matter for very long. Tomorrow, she would face them all again in that cold, imposing office, surrounded by oil paintings of stern-faced men who had built the Wells family fortune over generations. She would sit quietly while they divided up James's possessions like vultures picking over a carcass, grateful for whatever scraps they decided to throw her way. The house they had shared, the bank accounts, the investments James had mentioned but never fully explained, all of it would be scrutinized by people who had never worked an honest day in their lives, who had inherited their wealth and status, and believed it made them inherently superior to someone like her. But as the bus carried her through the darkening streets of Boston, Margaret allowed herself a small, secret smile. There were things about her past that the Wells family couldn't know, because James had been the only person she had ever trusted with the whole truth. Tomorrow's reading might not go exactly the way Victoria and Richard expected. Sometimes the people you underestimate the most turn out to be the ones with the most surprises hidden up their sleeves. The offices of Blackwood, Sterling and Associates occupied 3 floors of a gleaming granite building on State Street, its brass nameplate polished to mirror perfection. Margaret stepped off the city bus at the corner, her worn black purse clutched tightly against her side as she navigated through the afternoon crowds of well-dressed professionals. The November wind whipped through the urban canyon, carrying the scent of expensive coffee and exhaust fumes as she made her way toward the imposing entrance. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, she could see the Wells family already assembled in the marble lobby. Victoria Wellshampton stood near the reception desk in a tailored black suit that probably cost more than Margaret made in 3 months at the diner. Her platinum blonde hair was pulled back in a perfect chignon, and she gestured animatedly with manicured hands as she spoke to her husband Charles, a man whose inherited wealth had never required him to develop anything resembling a personality. Richard Wells paced near the elevator bank, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the polished stone floor. His navy blue suit was clearly custom-made, fitted perfectly to his tall frame, and his silver cufflinks caught the light from the crystal chandelier overhead. Beside him, his wife Sarah scrolled through her phone with obvious boredom, occasionally glancing up to survey their surroundings with the entitled air of someone who had never questioned her right to occupy expensive spaces. Margaret pushed through the heavy glass doors, immediately feeling the weight of their collective stare. The lobby's intimidating atmosphere seemed designed to make ordinary people feel small and out of place. With its towering ceiling, abstract art pieces that probably cost more than most people's homes, and furniture that looked more like museum displays than actual seating. The receptionist, a young woman with perfectly applied makeup and a crisp white blouse, looked up from her computer with professional courtesy that didn't quite mask her assessment of Margaret's obviously second-hand attire. "Good afternoon," the receptionist said smoothly. "You must be here for the Wells estate reading. Mr. Blackwood is expecting you in conference room A." Margaret nodded quietly, acutely aware that every eye in the lobby was tracking her movement as she signed the visitor log with a pen that probably cost more than her monthly grocery budget. Victoria's voice carried across the marble expanse with deliberate clarity, ensuring that Margaret would overhear every word. "I simply cannot understand what James was thinking," she said to Charles, shaking her head with theatrical disappointment. "That dress looks like something from a church rummage sale. The poor thing clearly has no idea how to present herself in civilized company." Charles murmured his agreement, his pale eyes following Margaret with the kind of disdain usually reserved for unpleasant insects. Richard abandoned his pacing to join his sister, his voice dropping to a stage whisper that was still loud enough to carry. "Well, at least this charade will be over soon," he declared with obvious satisfaction. Once we sort through James's affairs, we can finally send little Miss Margaret back to whatever trailer park she crawled out of. Maybe we should throw her a few dollars for bus fare home, as a charitable gesture." His laugh was cold and sharp, echoing off the polished surfaces like breaking glass. The elevator arrived with a soft chime, its brass doors opening to reveal an interior lined with rich mahogany panels and a mirror that reflected the family's smug expressions. Margaret stepped inside last, positioning herself near the back corner while the others clustered together near the front, their expensive perfumes and colognes creating a cloud of overwhelming fragrance that made her feel slightly nauseous. Victoria adjusted her pearl earrings and smoothed her suit jacket, clearly preparing for what she expected would be a triumphant conclusion to years of barely tolerated patience. Sarah finally looked up from her phone, her green eyes scanning Margaret from head to toe with unconcealed contempt. "I heard she didn't even graduate from a real college," she announced to no one in particular, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "Community college, if you can believe it. And she was working as a waitress when James met her, serving coffee and pie to truckers at some greasy little diner in Southie." The family exchanged knowing looks, their shared understanding clear. Margaret was exactly the kind of person who belonged in service positions, not sitting at the same table as their equals. The elevator rose smoothly through the building, passing floors occupied by other prestigious law firms, investment companies, and financial advisors who catered to Boston's old money families. Margaret caught glimpses of their offices through the glass panels, seeing more marble, more mahogany, more crystal chandeliers designed to remind visitors of their place in the social hierarchy. These were the spaces where the Wells family felt comfortable and entitled, where their inherited wealth and social connections opened doors that remained firmly closed to people like her. When the doors opened on the 15th floor, they were greeted by a secretary whose silver hair was styled in an elegant bob and whose black dress probably cost more than Margaret's monthly rent. She led them down a hallway lined with oil paintings of stern-faced men in judicial robes, past smaller conference rooms where other wealthy families were no doubt conducting similar business, dividing up estates and inheritances with the casual efficiency of people who had never wanted for anything. Conference room A was exactly what Margaret had expected, a long mahogany table surrounded by leather chairs that looked like they belonged in an exclusive gentleman's club, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with legal volumes bound in rich burgundy leather, and tall windows that offered a commanding view of Boston Harbor. Harrison Blackwood stood near the head of the table, his silver hair combed back and his navy suit impeccably pressed. He was a man in his 60s who had spent decades managing the legal affairs of Boston's elite families, his stern expression suggesting he had seen every form of human greed and pettiness that money could inspire. "Please, take your seats," Blackwood said in a voice that carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. His gray eyes swept across the assembled family members before settling briefly on Margaret, and she caught something in his expression that she couldn't quite identify. It wasn't sympathy exactly, but perhaps a hint of knowledge that the others didn't share. He gestured toward the chairs around the table, and Margaret noticed that he made no distinction in seating arrangements, treating her with the same formal courtesy he extended to the others. Victoria settled into her chair with obvious satisfaction, crossing her legs and placing her designer handbag on the table like a territorial marker. "This shouldn't take very long," she said confidently to Richard, who had chosen the seat directly across from Margaret. "James was always sentimental about money, but I'm sure he made sensible provisions in the end." Richard nodded approvingly, already mentally dividing his brother's assets among the people he considered truly deserving. Sarah opened her phone again and began scrolling through what appeared to be real estate listings, occasionally showing the screen to Richard and whispering about vacation properties and investment opportunities. Their assumption was clear. Whatever James had left behind would soon be redistributed among family members who understood its proper value, who knew how to maintain and multiply wealth rather than squander it on working-class sentimentality. Margaret represented everything they despised about James's brief rebellion against family expectations, his temporary lapse in judgment that had thankfully reached its natural conclusion. Harrison Blackwood arranged a thick stack of documents on the table before him, each page bearing official seals and signatures that carried the weight of legal authority. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began formally, his voice filling the impressive room with practiced gravitas. "We are here today to execute the final will and testament of James Wellington Wells, who passed away on November 15th of this year." His tone was measured and professional, giving no hint of the surprises that lay ahead, but Margaret noticed his fingers drumming once, almost imperceptibly, against the leather portfolio beside him. Harrison Blackwood opened the leather portfolio with deliberate precision, removing a document sealed with red wax that bore the official stamp of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. The afternoon lights streaming through the tall windows cast long shadows across the mahogany table as he broke the seal with a silver letter opener, the sound sharp and final in the hushed conference room. Margaret felt her heart hammering against her ribs while Victoria and Richard leaned forward with barely concealed anticipation, their faces wearing the expressions of people about to receive exactly what they believed they deserved. The attorney cleared his throat and began reading in his measured, professional tone. "I, James Wellington Wells, being of sound mind and body, do hereby set forth my final will and testament on this 23rd day of September, in the year of our Lord 2023. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she folded them in her lap, remembering that September day when James had insisted on updating his will after his latest doctor's visit. He had kissed her forehead and promised that she would never have to worry about anything, that he would always take care of her no matter what happened. Blackwood continued reading through the standard legal language, his voice steady and authoritative as he outlined the various provisions James had made for charitable donations and personal bequests. "To the Boston Children's Hospital, I leave the sum of $50,000 to continue their excellent work. To my longtime housekeeper, Mrs. Eleanor Rodriguez, I leave the sum of $25,000 in appreciation for her years of faithful service." Victoria shifted impatiently in her chair, clearly eager to move past these preliminaries to what she considered the real business at hand. Then came the moment that would shatter the family's assumptions completely. "To my beloved wife, Margaret Elizabeth Wells, I leave our family home at 247 Commonwealth Avenue, along with all its contents, furnishings, and personal effects." Victoria's sharp intake of breath was audible across the room, her perfectly manicured fingers gripping the edge of the table until her knuckles turned white. The attorney continued without pause, his expression carefully neutral. "I also leave to Margaret all of my personal bank accounts, investment portfolios, and retirement funds, totaling approximately $2.7 million, so that she may continue to live in the comfort and security she deserves." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the ticking of an antique grandfather clock in the corner of the room. Richard's face had turned an alarming shade of red, his jaw clenched so tightly that the muscles in his neck stood out like cords. "This is impossible," he finally managed to choke out, his voice rising with each word. "James would never leave everything to her. There must be some mistake, some coercion involved. No man in his right mind would give away the family home to a waitress from Southie." Victoria shot to her feet with such force that her leather chair rolled backward and struck the bookshelf behind her. "This is absolutely outrageous," she declared, her voice shaking with fury and disbelief. "That house has been in our family for 4 generations. Our great-grandfather built his fortune from that address. The idea that some gold-digging opportunist would inherit what belongs to us by blood is completely unacceptable." She whirled to face Margaret, her blue eyes blazing with an intensity that would have been frightening if Margaret hadn't spent 5 years building up immunity to the family's cruelty. Margaret remained perfectly still in her chair, her hands folded calmly in her lap despite the storm of emotion raging around her. She had learned long ago that showing fear or distress only encouraged the Wells family to escalate their attacks, so she kept her expression serene and her voice quiet when she finally spoke. "James made his decisions based on love, not obligation," she said simply. "He wanted me to be taken care of because he knew how much we meant to each other." Her words carried a dignity that seemed to infuriate Victoria even more, the contrast between Margaret's composure and the family's explosive reaction making their behavior appear increasingly unhinged. Sarah had gone pale, her phone forgotten on the table as she stared at Margaret with something approaching horror. $2.7 million, she whispered, as if saying the amount aloud would somehow make it less real. Plus the Commonwealth Avenue house, which must be worth at least another $1.5 million. Charles nodded grimly beside his wife, his usual passive demeanor replaced by calculating anger. "We'll contest this immediately," he announced with cold certainty. "No judge in Massachusetts will allow this kind of obvious manipulation to stand." James was clearly not thinking clearly in his final months. Richard began pacing behind his chair like a caged animal, his expensive shoes clicking against the hardwood floor with increasing agitation. "There has to be evidence of undue influence," he declared, pointing an accusing finger at Margaret. "This woman clearly took advantage of my brother's illness and grief to manipulate him into changing his will. No reasonable person would believe that James voluntarily chose to disinherit his own family in favor of someone he barely knew." The accusation hung in the air like a toxic cloud, but Margaret met his furious gaze without flinching, her years of dealing with difficult customers having taught her to remain calm under pressure. Harrison Blackwood had been watching this outburst with the detached interest of someone who had witnessed countless family feuds over inherited wealth, but now he raised one hand to restore order to the proceedings. "I can assure you that Mr. Wells was examined by 2 independent physicians who certified his mental competency at the time this will was executed," he said firmly. "Furthermore, the document was witnessed by 3 separate individuals who can testify that he was acting of his own free will and was not under any form of coercion or undue influence." The attorney's matter-of-fact delivery of these facts seemed to deflate some of Richard's bluster, though his anger remained plainly visible. Victoria sank back into her chair, her face pale except for 2 bright spots of color high on her cheekbones. "But what about the trust funds?" she asked desperately, grasping for any remaining hope. Surely James didn't have the authority to dispose of family money that was held in trust. There must be provisions for the family business interests and the investments that have been passed down through generations. Her voice carried a note of pleading that she would have found humiliating under normal circumstances, but desperation had stripped away her usual pretense of superiority. The lawyer consulted his documents again, flipping through several pages before finding the relevant section. Mr. Wells had no authority over the family trust funds or business interests, which remain under separate management as established by your grandfather's original will, he confirmed. Those assets continue to be distributed according to the trust documents executed in 1978. However, the personal wealth that James accumulated during his own career, including his salary as a partner in the architectural firm and his individual investment decisions, was his to dispose of as he saw fit. This clarification provided some small measure of relief to the assembled family members, but it was clear that the psychological blow of James's will had fundamentally altered their perception of both him and Margaret. The man they had thought they knew, their brother who had always been somewhat sentimental but ultimately practical about family obligations, had revealed himself to be someone entirely different. He had chosen love over loyalty, personal happiness over family tradition, and in doing so had elevated Margaret from an unwelcome outsider to a position of genuine financial independence. Margaret felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes, not from sadness, but from an overwhelming sense of gratitude toward the man she had loved more than life itself. James had kept his promise to take care of her, had used his own resources to ensure that she would never again have to depend on the kindness of people who had no intention of being kind. The knowledge that he had chosen her so deliberately, so completely, filled her with a warmth that no amount of family hostility could diminish. But Harrison Blackwood was not finished with his revelations. He cleared his throat again and gathered another set of documents from his portfolio, his expression taking on an almost mysterious quality that made Margaret's pulse quicken with anticipation. "There are, however, additional matters that must be addressed before we conclude today's proceedings," he announced, his gray eyes moving slowly around the table to make contact with each person present. "These concern certain family assets and historical documents that have recently come to light, matters that may significantly impact everyone's understanding of the current situation." Harrison Blackwood reached into his leather portfolio and withdrew a manila folder sealed with multiple wax stamps. each bearing different official insignias that spoke of government offices, genealogical societies, and legal institutions. The folder appeared significantly older than the other documents he had been consulting, its edges worn smooth by decades of handling. And when he placed it on the mahogany table, Margaret noticed that several family members leaned forward despite themselves, drawn by an instinctive recognition that something momentous was about to unfold. The attorney's fingers worked methodically to break each seal, his movements deliberate and ceremonial in a way that suggested he understood the gravity of what he was about to reveal. The contents include genealogical records, birth certificates, marriage documents, and legal papers dating back to 1897. He began, his voice taking on the measured cadence of someone delivering testimony before a high court. These documents were discovered in a safety deposit box that had been sealed for over 25 years, accessible only upon the death of James Wellington Wells and only in the presence of his surviving spouse. Victoria's breath caught in her throat, her intuition clearly warning her that whatever was coming would not be in her favor. While Richard shifted uncomfortably in his leather chair, his earlier confidence beginning to evaporate like morning fog. Sarah had gone completely still, her usual restless energy replaced by the frozen posture of someone watching a slow-motion disaster unfold. And even Charles seemed to sense that the comfortable world of inherited privilege he had always known was about to be fundamentally altered. Blackwood lifted the first document from the folder, a birth certificate yellowed with age but still clearly legible in its formal 19th-century script. This is the birth certificate of Margaret Elizabeth Ashford, born on March 15, 1897, to Jonathan and Catherine Ashford in Boston, Massachusetts, he read aloud, his voice carrying clearly in the suddenly silent room. Margaret felt her heart racing as she recognized the name that had been hidden from her for so many years, the identity that her adoptive parents had promised to reveal when she turned 18, only to die in a car accident when she was 16, taking their secrets with them to the grave. The attorney continued with methodical precision, consulting a second document that appeared to be a marriage certificate. On June 20, 1915, Margaret Elizabeth Ashford married Wellington Theodore Ashford Wellington, uniting two of Boston's most prominent families and creating the foundation for what would become one of New England's largest private fortunes. The hyphenated surname was preserved according to the specific wishes expressed in both families' wills, ensuring that the Ashford legacy would continue alongside the Wellington name for future generations. Richard's face had gone ashen, the implications beginning to penetrate his stunned consciousness like cold water seeping through cracked stone. "That's impossible," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the ticking of the grandfather clock. "The Ashford-Wellington Trust has been the foundation of our family's wealth for over a century. You're suggesting that this woman," he gestured weakly toward Margaret, "somehow has a connection to our great-great-grandparents." His words trailed off as he seemed to realize how absurd his protest sounded even as he spoke it. Harrison Blackwood nodded gravely and produced a third document, this one bearing multiple official seals and signed by various legal authorities. Margaret Elizabeth Ashford Wellington gave birth to a son, Wellington James Ashford Wellington, on December 3, 1916, he read with ceremonial solemnity. This child would later become known as Wellington James Wells after the family simplified their name during the anti-immigrant sentiment of the 1920s. He became the grandfather of Victoria Wells Hampton, Richard Wells, and the late James Wellington Wells. The silence that followed this revelation was profound and terrible, broken only by Victoria's sharp intake of breath, as the full meaning of what she had just heard crashed over her like a tsunami destroying everything in its path. "But that would mean," she began, her voice rising to a near shriek, "that this woman is our great-great-granddaughter. That she paused, unable to force the words past her lips, the actual blood heir to the Ashford-Wellington fortune that built everything we have." Margaret remained perfectly composed in her chair, her hands still folded calmly in her lap despite the chaos erupting around her. She had known this moment would come eventually, had carried the burden of this secret knowledge for 5 years while enduring their cruelty and condescension, always wondering if she would ever have the courage to reveal the truth about her heritage. When she finally spoke, Her voice carried a quiet authority that seemed to fill the impressive conference room with unexpected power. "My name is Margaret Elizabeth Ashford Wellington," she said simply, each word falling into the stunned silence like stones into still water. "I am the great-great-granddaughter of Margaret and Wellington Ashford Wellington, the direct descendant of the people who established the trust fund that has supported your family for 4 generations. I have known this since before I married James, but I chose to keep my identity secret because I wanted him to love me for who I was, not for what I represented." Richard's chair scraped against the hardwood floor as he pushed back from the table, his face cycling through expressions of disbelief, horror, and dawning comprehension. "You knew," he accused, his voice shaking with rage and humiliation. "You knew who you were this entire time, and you let us treat you like some kind of charity case. You sat there while we made jokes about your background, while we questioned your motives, while we tried to exclude you from family gatherings." His words came out in a rush, each one revealing his growing understanding of how completely the family had humiliated themselves. Victoria had begun to hyperventilate, her carefully controlled composure cracking like ice under pressure as she realized the magnitude of their mistake. "We called her a gold digger," she whispered, her voice filled with dawning horror. "We said she was trying to steal our inheritance when she was actually the rightful heir to everything we have. Every cruel word, every dismissive gesture, every moment of condescension had been directed at the very person whose bloodline had created their wealth and social position in the first place." Harrison Blackwood produced another set of documents, these bearing the official letterhead of the Ashford Wellington Trust and signed by multiple bank officials and legal authorities. According to the genealogical research conducted by the trust administrators, Margaret Elizabeth Ashford Wellington is the sole surviving direct descendant of the original trust founders, he announced with grave formality. As such, she has certain rights and privileges that supersede the derivative benefits that have been extended to collateral family members over the past century. Sarah had gone completely pale, her hands trembling as she reached for her purse, as if preparing to flee from a crime scene. "This means that everything we have, everything we've inherited, everything we think belongs to us," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper, "actually belongs to her. The investments, the trust distributions, the family properties that have been passed down through generations, all of it traces back to her bloodline, not ours." Margaret finally allowed herself a small smile, not one of triumph or vindictiveness, but of profound relief at no longer having to carry the burden of this secret alone. "I never wanted to use my heritage as a weapon against any of you," she said gently, her voice carrying none of the anger that would have been justified after years of abuse. "When I met James, I was working as a waitress because I chose to support myself rather than claim what I was entitled to by birth. I wanted to build a life based on love and hard work, not inherited privilege." Charles seemed to have aged a decade in the past few minutes, his usually confident demeanor replaced by the haunted expression of someone watching their entire worldview collapse in real time. "But why?" he asked desperately, his voice cracking with emotion. "Why would you subject yourself to our treatment when you could have revealed the truth at any time? Why endure years of our contempt when a single conversation could have changed everything?" Margaret's expression grew thoughtful as she considered how to explain a decision that had shaped 5 years of her life, a choice that had required enormous strength and conviction in the face of constant humiliation. "Because I wanted James to love Margaret the waitress, not Margaret the heiress," she replied with quiet dignity. "I wanted to know that our marriage was built on genuine affection, not on his family's approval or his desire to align himself with my inheritance. I needed to be certain that what we had together was real and lasting, not just another strategic alliance between wealthy families." Richard slumped forward in his chair, his head in his hands, as the full scope of the family's behavior became clear to him for the first time. Every family dinner where they had made snide comments about Margaret's background, every holiday gathering where they had deliberately excluded her from conversations about family business, every social event where they had treated her like an embarrassing appendage rather than a valued family member, all of it had been directed at the person who had more right to be there than any of them. Victoria's perfectly applied makeup had begun to run as tears of humiliation and regret streaked down her cheeks. her usual poise completely abandoned in the face of this devastating revelation. "We treated you like a servant," she whispered, her voice filled with self-loathing. "We made jokes about your education, your job, your clothes, your background, when all along you were the most important person in the room. We were the charity cases, not you. We were the ones living off your family's generosity without even knowing it." Harrison Blackwood consulted his pocket watch and cleared his throat diplomatically, clearly aware that the emotional impact of these revelations needed time to settle before he could proceed with the remaining legal business. "Perhaps we should take a brief recess to allow everyone to process this information," he suggested with professional tact. "There are still several additional matters to discuss, but they may be easier to address once everyone has had a moment to absorb these significant developments." Margaret stood gracefully from her chair, her movements carrying a natural authority that had been hidden beneath years of deliberate self-effacement. She looked around the conference room at the family members who had spent so much energy trying to diminish her, and for the first time in 5 years, she allowed them to see a glimpse of who she really was beneath the humble facade she had carefully maintained. "I never wanted this to be a confrontation," she said quietly, her voice carrying the unmistakable ring of truth. "I hope that someday we could all be a real family, united by love rather than divided by prejudice and assumptions." James believed that was possible, and even now, I still hope he was right. But going forward, I think it's important that we all understand exactly where we stand with each other and what our true relationships actually are. Harrison Blackwood returned to the conference room carrying an additional briefcase, his expression grave as he set it beside his original portfolio, and began removing documents that bore the official seals of multiple financial institutions and government agencies. The family members had reassembled around the mahogany table, but the atmosphere had shifted dramatically from the earlier proceedings, with Victoria and Richard now sitting in positions of obvious submission, while Margaret occupied her chair with the quiet confidence of someone who had finally stepped into her rightful place. The attorney opened a thick folder marked with the logo of Boston Trust and Banking, the institution that had managed the Ashford Wellington assets for over a century. According to the comprehensive audit conducted at Mrs. Wells's request following her marriage to James, he began in his measured professional tone. "The original Ashford Wellington Trust, established in 1898, currently holds assets valued at approximately $427 million. These include real estate holdings, investment portfolios, corporate shares, and various financial instruments that have grown substantially over the past 125 years. Victoria's face had gone completely white, her hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly that her knuckles stood out like sharp ridges beneath her pale skin. $400 million, she repeated in a whisper, her voice barely audible above the sound of traffic from the street 15 floors below. The number seemed to hang in the air like a physical presence, dwarfing every assumption the family had made about their own wealth and status over the course of their entire lives. Blackwood consulted another document, this one bearing multiple signatures and official stamps from various legal authorities. As the sole surviving direct descendant of the trust founders, Mrs. Margaret Ashford Wellington Wells has the legal authority to assume full control of these assets at any time she chooses to exercise that right, he continued with ceremonial gravity. The derivative benefits that have been extended to collateral family members, including the monthly distributions that have supported the Wells family lifestyle for 4 generations, exist solely at the discretion of the primary beneficiary. Richard seemed to age before their eyes as the full implications of this revelation settled over him like a suffocating blanket. "Everything we have," he said slowly, his voice hollow with dawning comprehension, "our houses, our cars, our club memberships, our children's education funds, all of it comes from trust distributions that she could terminate with a single signature. We're not wealthy in our own right. We're essentially living on her charity without ever knowing it." Margaret watched their reactions with a mixture of sadness and vindication, feeling no joy in their distress, but unable to deny a certain satisfaction at finally seeing them understand the truth about their circumstances. For 5 years she had endured their condescension about her background, their assumptions about her motives, their cruel jokes about her supposed gold-digging tendencies, all while knowing that their comfortable lifestyle depended entirely on the generosity of the very bloodline they were mocking. Sarah had begun crying quietly, her tears falling onto the polished mahogany surface as she realized how completely she had misjudged the woman she had spent years treating as an unwelcome intruder. "We could have been friends," she whispered brokenly, her voice thick with regret and self-recrimination. "Instead of making enemies, we could have welcomed you into the family. We could have celebrated James's happiness instead of resenting it. But we were so blinded by our own arrogance that we couldn't see past our prejudices." Harrison Blackwood produced yet another set of documents, these bearing the letterhead of the Massachusetts Superior Court and signed by multiple judges over several decades. Mrs. Wells also has the legal standing to challenge the simplified surname change that occurred in the 1920s, he announced with careful precision. The court records indicate that the transition from Ashford Wellington to simply Wells was never formally ratified according to the original trust documents, which means the current family name may not have proper legal standing in relation to the inherited assets. Charles had gone gray around the edges, his usually composed demeanor completely shattered by the revelation that even their family identity might be subject to Margaret's approval. "This means she could legally require us to revert to the original hyphenated name," he said in a voice barely above a whisper, "or she could deny our connection to the family legacy entirely if she chose to exercise her rights as the primary heir. We exist in this family structure only because she allows it, not because we have any inherent claim to it." Victoria suddenly pushed back from the table and dropped to her knees beside Margaret's chair, her designer suit crumpling against the hardwood floor as she abandoned every pretense of dignity and pride. "Please," she begged, her voice cracking with desperation, "I know we've been horrible to you, but please don't punish our children for our mistakes. They don't deserve to lose their inheritance because their parents were too stupid and prejudiced to recognize who you really were." Margaret looked down at the woman who had spent years making her feel small and unwelcome, seeing her now reduced to pleading for the mercy that she herself had never been offered. Richard joined his sister in this unprecedented display of humility, his own knees hitting the floor as he reached out with shaking hands to grasp Margaret's arm. "We'll do anything," he promised frantically, his voice high and strained with panic. "We'll publicly apologize for every cruel word, every dismissive gesture, every moment of disrespect. We'll acknowledge our mistake to everyone we know, admit that we were wrong about everything. Just please don't take away everything our children have ever known. They're innocent in all this." Margaret felt a complex mixture of emotions washing over her as she looked down at these two people who had once seemed so powerful and intimidating, now reduced to begging for her forgiveness on the floor of a law office. There was satisfaction in seeing justice finally served, but also genuine sadness at how completely their relationship had been poisoned by years of mutual misunderstanding and deliberate cruelty. "I never wanted any of this to be about punishment or revenge," she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had spent years thinking about this moment. "All I ever wanted was to be accepted as James's wife, to be treated with basic human dignity instead of constant suspicion and contempt. The fact that it took a legal revelation to make you see me as a person worth respecting says more about your character than it does about mine." She gently extracted her arm from Richard's desperate grasp and helped both siblings return to their chairs, her gesture carrying more grace and compassion than they had ever shown her during the worst moments of their cruelty. "However," she continued with calm authority, "I'm not interested in destroying the family or punishing innocent children for their parents' mistakes. What I want going forward is honesty, respect, and genuine effort to build something better than what we've had before." Harrison Blackwood cleared his throat diplomatically, recognizing that the emotional intensity of the moment needed to be channeled into practical arrangements. "Perhaps we should discuss the specific terms under which the current family structure might continue," he suggested with professional tact. "Mrs. Wells clearly has options that need to be considered, and it would be beneficial for everyone to understand exactly what those options entail before making any final decisions about the future." Margaret looked around the conference room one final time, seeing the family members who had once dismissed her as an ignorant outsider now hanging on her every word with desperate attention. The power dynamic had shifted so completely that she almost felt dizzy from the reversal, but she was determined to use her newfound authority more wisely than they had ever used theirs. Margaret rose from her chair with the quiet authority of someone who had finally stepped into her birthright, her movements carrying a grace that seemed to transform the very atmosphere of the conference room. She looked around the mahogany table at the family members who had spent years trying to diminish her, seeing them now not as enemies to be conquered, but as people who needed guidance toward becoming better versions of themselves. I want to honor James's memory by showing the kind of generosity and forgiveness that he always believed was possible, she announced, her voice steady and clear in the hushed room. Therefore, I will not be exercising my rights to terminate the trust distributions or alter the family structure that has supported you for generations. However, she paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle over them like morning light breaking through storm clouds. There will be conditions that reflect the respect and dignity that every family member deserves. Victoria nodded eagerly, her earlier arrogance completely replaced by genuine humility and gratitude. We understand completely, she said, her voice thick with emotion. Whatever you require from us, whatever changes you need to see, we'll do everything in our power to earn your forgiveness and prove that we can be the family James always wanted us to be. Richard murmured his fervent agreement, his face showing a sincerity that had been notably absent during their previous interactions. Over the following months, the transformation was remarkable to witness. Victoria personally organized a family dinner where she stood before the assembled relatives and friends to publicly apologize for the years of cruelty she had inflicted on Margaret, her words carrying the weight of genuine remorse. Richard followed suit by establishing a scholarship fund in Margaret's honor at the community college she had attended, acknowledging her achievements and intelligence in front of the same social circle that had once mocked her background. The Commonwealth Avenue house, which had once felt like enemy territory where Margaret was barely tolerated, gradually became a warm family home where she was not merely accepted but genuinely cherished. Sarah began including her in planning family events, seeking her opinions and treating her contributions with the respect they had always deserved. Charles, who had once dismissed her as insignificant, now listened carefully when she spoke and made efforts to understand her perspective on family matters. Most importantly, the cruel whispers and condescending remarks that had poisoned every family gathering for 5 years were replaced by conversations that included Margaret as an equal participant. The transformation wasn't immediate or perfect, but it was authentic, driven by the family's genuine recognition of how badly they had failed both Margaret and James's memory with their previous behavior. 6 months after that fateful day in Harrison Blackwood's conference room, Margaret found herself standing once again at James's grave in Greenwood Cemetery. But this time, she was not alone. Victoria stood beside her with a fresh bouquet of white roses, her face peaceful as she whispered her own words of apology to her deceased brother. Richard and his family had joined them, along with Charles and Sarah, creating a circle of genuine mourners who had finally learned to honor both James's life and his choices. Margaret knelt to place her weekly rose against the headstone, feeling the familiar ache of loss tempered now by the warmth of family acceptance she had never experienced before. "James," she whispered softly, "you would be so proud to see how much we've all grown. They finally understand what you always tried to tell them about love being more important than money or status or family expectations." As she stood, Victoria gently took her arm, the gesture carrying none of the condescension that had once characterized their interactions. "Thank you for giving us the chance to become better people," she said simply. "We don't deserve your forgiveness, but we're grateful for it every single day." The other family members nodded their agreement, their faces showing the kind of peace that comes from finally understanding what truly matters in life. Margaret looked around at the faces surrounding her, seeing not the cruel strangers who had once made her life miserable, but the family that James had always believed they could become with time, patience, and the transformative power of unconditional love. Sometimes the people who hurt us the most are simply afraid of losing what they think defines them. And sometimes the greatest victory comes not from destroying our enemies, but from helping them discover who they really could be. If you've ever been underestimated or dismissed because of where you came from or what people assumed about you, drop a comment and share your thoughts about this incredible transformation. Margaret's journey from widow to family matriarch shows us that true power comes not from birth or wealth, but from maintaining dignity and grace even when others fail to recognize our worth.